Hello, everyone. We are here today to talk a little bit about the Technical Advisory for Suicide Prevention Education, that law, and specifically the model policy that has been put out by the New Hampshire School Boards Association. My name is Ellen Desmond, and I'm the Special Projects Coordinator at the Bureau of Student Wellness at the New Hampshire Department of Education. And I'm joined by one of my colleagues and by Will Phillips, who is here from the New Hampshire School Boards Association. So we're going to take you through the technical advisory today briefly, and then really dive in deeply into that model policy that the New Hampshire School Boards Association has provided for us. So the technical advisory was put out by our office, the Office of Social and Emotional Wellness, when the Senate Bill 282 was made into law shortly thereafter in September 2019. And the purpose of this is to just help give a little bit of context to what the statute actually says, what is required of New Hampshire's school districts. And as an addendum to that, the New Hampshire School Boards Association has provided a model policy that will meet the statute, the requirements of the statute. So you can see from this technical advisory, which you can access on our website, that there's an overview of the new law. There are some resources and some information about both the law, what is required, and then some resources to help you meet the law. And you can check out our video all about the intro to SB 282, which is now RSA 193J in law. You can check out that video on our playlist, and that is where my colleague Lisa Hayward and I talk all about what the law says and kind of break it down for you. You can also check out some of the resources that we have posted pertaining to the trainings that are offered throughout New Hampshire, which is something that is required of New Hampshire school districts. And you can check those out also on that playlist, the 282 and the 603 playlist. And then there are some national resources as well that you may want to take a look at, including some model policy guidance through the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention and the model policy on suicide prevention from the Trevor Project. Both of those were considered when the New Hampshire School Boards Association created this model policy that our guest today is going to walk us through. So I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Lisa to introduce Will Phillips.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Ellen, for the wonderful overview and the introduction. My name is Lisa Hayward. I work with my colleague Ellen at the Bureau of Student Wellness. And today we've got Will Phillips joining us. So, Will, we have a couple of questions for you, and we're really looking forward to your responses. So let me start off with the first question. Could you introduce yourself and the New Hampshire School Board Association? And as you do so, tell us a little bit about the process that you used for crafting the model policy. And also for our viewers, could you clarify the difference between a policy and a plan and what the statute requires?
Well, there's a lot of them. Hello, everyone. As they mentioned, I'm Will Phillips. I'm the Director of Policy Services and Staff Attorney for the New Hampshire School Boards Association. The association is a nonprofit organization that is comprised of voluntary membership by the majority of school districts or school boards in New Hampshire. Our members are collectively the boards themselves, which is different than both the Department of Education and also a number of other similar organizations for various components of the public school system. So for instance, we have a New Hampshire School Administrators Association and a New Hampshire Principals Association. Those are all different, and they represent those specific entities. But from the School Boards Association, we're quite frequently engaged in really policy recommendations and advice for school boards. The policy is really the mechanism through which your local governing body, sets the parameters, the goals, and objectives for the local school district. So sometimes we get a statute like SB 282 from 2019 that says the local school board shall have a policy. Other times we'll have a statute or regulation that says the local school district shall do something. And so we might have a policy that says what the district's supposed to do. That's not a required policy, but we might recommend it. But in this instance, as I mentioned, SB 282, which is now codified as RSA 193J, and that's the suicide prevention statute. And that statute does specifically require that a school board adopt a policy. And one of the things that might be a little bit confusing in the way the language is used in the statute, but maybe more importantly with some of the resources that Ellen and Lisa discussed, are that those sample policies are much broader than the NHSBA sample that you find at the end of the TA. And the reason is because those policies, those other samples really are what is contemplated in our statute as the plan. 193J requires a local board to develop a policy, and then it says to guide development and implementation of a coordinated plan. So you got a plan and a policy a little bit different. Than the policy is required to have certain elements. Then the district is also required to assure that all staff and consultants, and even though the statute doesn't define consultants in this context, it's typically intended to mean those who work directly with students. The statute requires that all employees and consultants receive 2 hours of training each year relating to, again, going through many of the same pieces that were required in the policy. So youth suicide risk factors, warning signs, protective factors, response procedures, referrals, and then post-intervention and available resources. Paragraph 2, I think it's a 193J2, and you'll see that it's within 9 months of the effective date of this chapter. So this chapter, the effective date is July 1st of 2020. It was enacted in 2019, but occasionally the legislature recognizes that school districts can't all of a sudden create out of thin air first the policy, then the plan, then the training programs, and never mind the necessary resources for bringing those all to fruition. So you can't do that with the drop of a dime. So they did give school districts a little bit over a year to start planning for this. So the effective date of the statute is July 1st of this year, and the 9-month deadline will be April of next year. So by April of next year, all faculty and staff, including contracted personnel, have to have at least 2 hours of training, and then you'll see that annually. And so that lays out the whole training component. One thing I'll point out is, so when we think back on the first requirement, which was to have a policy that guides a coordinated plan, the effective date is the effective date. So that's July 1st, 2020. Districts are supposed to have a policy for that, though there is no stated deadline for either creating the policy or for, probably more importantly, creating the plan that's called for by the policy. When we published our sample policy, we did this, we published this in late 2019, and the reason we did it was, as it says here in this point A, although the law is not effective till July 1st, 2020, there are many provisions which may have budgetary and planning impacts. It is therefore important for districts to carefully review the staffing and programming implications for FY 2021. So we did adopt this last year, and that probably would have been a good amount of time to really get this up and running. But then, as we all know, some things happened this year. So back to paragraph 3. School suicide prevention policies required under paragraph 1 and the training required under paragraph 2 shall be evidence informed. On the one hand, you would think, do we really need to say that? In any event, there's really no, there's nothing beyond what's in there. I think if districts use the resources that the DOE has identified in the TA, many of which are the same resources that we identified in our own sample policy at the end. Those are all going to be evidence-based, but you just have that extra requirement. You also have, and then paragraph 4, just indicating that there's no specific curriculum or materials that you're required to have. It really is up to a local district as to how they are going to conduct their training, what materials they're going to use, what program they're going to use. It's a common approach to policy requirements in the state of New Hampshire. You've all heard local control relative to education. That's one of the way it manifests itself. So the state will say you have to do this, but we're not going to tell you specifically what you have to do. You just have to work within a certain framework, and that's just an example of the kind of language we might find. And then lastly, in the statute anyway, you have an immunity provision. So the first sentence of 193J3 indicates that there's no private right of action against the school relative to this policy or failure to have a policy. And then the next sentence, and maybe a couple of sentences, just indicates that if somebody does bring a claim against an employee or against a school, you will have immunity from civil liability for trying to implement or failing to implement the statute. So that's sometimes an important consideration for when they do these kinds of policies. In any event, that's the statute, and then let's wander into the policy, and I'll try to explain, how I set this up. Now, we just went through the statute. The statute doesn't necessarily incorporate all of the elements that you might find in the plan, and in some places the language that's used in the statute differs from what you might find in some of the so-called model policies that we've already talked about. So the AFSP and the Trevor Project, those policies in my head are more like what the plan is. The plan that's referenced in the statute and referenced in this policy, the NHSBA policy. When we're talking about the suicide prevention plan, that's the look at the AFSP model, and that's what a plan might look like. It really gets into more of the meat and more of the substance of all the different elements that the statute requires and that this policy requires. So the first thing that policy does is identify the pieces from the statute that the policy is required to have. And we first start off with a policy statement. So the school board is committed to, etc. Then we get to the paragraph A. No later than May 31st, the superintendent shall develop and provide to the board for approval a written plan. One piece in here that is not a requirement, remember that I said that the only deadline in the statute was the 9-month deadline for training after the effective date, so that would be April of next year. The reason we put a date in here is to maybe light a fire under everyone's feet, that, you know, this is something that they need to be doing. They need to be working on this and identifying, you know, what personnel are going to be responsible for various things. And unfortunately, there are very few districts that have a plan in place by this point in time, and you know, that might have been an optimistic date even in the best of circumstances, and as we know, we don't have the best of circumstances. So if you are working in a district that hasn't adopted the policy yet, you know, really start thinking about how they were going to put together first a policy and then a plan. The other thing that I'll point out from this paragraph is that the plan was going to be something that was the product of the administration as opposed to directly from the school board. So the school board is adopting a policy here and then is directing the administration to develop the plan. And that's a standard approach to you know, the difference between governance and management. The school board creates the broad parameters of a policy, and then the administration implements those policies by way of either administrative regulations or procedures, some of which are written, some of which are not. Most usually are not. But in this case, we're saying not only do we want you to implement this policy, but we want you to develop a coordinated written plan. Which is using the language referenced in the statute. And then it identifies the same elements for the plan that are included in the statute. Okay, so this paragraph includes a couple of, first it includes the provisions that are spelled out in the statute. And then it also includes provisions that are addressed in the Trevor Project policy, and again, which is the same as the AFSP policy. So, for instance, I think confidentiality considerations in E, that's not something that's called out for in the statute, I don't believe. There are a couple of things that are very important when you're doing this plan, even though they're not mentioned in the statute. And so what we've done with this paragraph 1 here is include the statutory requirements, flesh them out a little bit, and then also included some additional provisions which, you know, irrespective of the resource that you're looking for, they find these to be, you know, essential to a well-developed anti-suicide or a suicide prevention plan. Okay, we can scroll down a little bit more. So you can see that quite a few additional provisions than those that are found in the statute. Then the next part, so remember, I'm just at paragraph 2 here. So remember where we are here is administration, please create the plan. And then the plan will include these things. And then this paragraph 2 is, we want this plan to be reviewed every 2 years. Quite often, I've been working, I represented school districts for over 20 years before I came to NHSBA. And one of the things that I can tell you is that you create a policy, and it might be a very important policy, and you put it in the policy manual, and then everybody forgets that it's there. Which is problematic for many, many reasons. But in this instance, we want this plan to be looked at least every 2 years. And maybe the plan is so fantastic in the first iteration that it doesn't need a lot of tinkering, and the only thing you're doing is changing the, you know, the names of the people involved or something like that. But you know, I would expect that more often than not, you're finding different places where you can improve it, or you know, maybe places where it didn't work as well as it should have, that kind of thing. So you basically are going to have a 2-year review process. And here, you know, the superintendent, it's no longer just the superintendent. The superintendent is consulting with some of the personnel that are created within the plan itself, which you'll see down here. So actually, if you just go back up a little bit, Ellen, there we go, just right there. So you see here that the superintendent is to consult with the district suicide prevention coordinator and then the building suicide prevention liaisons. Those are just names that I came up with. The members of New Hampshire School Board Association, they range from the very largest districts in the state to many districts which are maybe K through 4. So we're not going to have both a district suicide prevention coordinator and a building suicide prevention liaison. We're just going to have one person, and that person may be the school counselor, that person may be the superintendent, but there will be a person who is responsible for doing these things. And if you remember, that was one of the requirements of the statute. The policy had to identify the personnel within the buildings who are going to be acting as I think they called it the point of contact. So now we go down to paragraph B here, and it's just the creation of these provisions. So the superintendent shall appoint, or the policy could say, as I just mentioned, it might just say the superintendent shall act as the district suicide prevention coordinator. Maybe the superintendent's not the best person for that, but in many instances, especially in the tiny districts, it's impossible really to give that function to somebody else. So the policy either says superintendent appoints, or the policy will identify the person responsible. And then these next several paragraphs are just the duties or the functions that the district coordinator will serve. And then we get down to paragraph 2, and this really is for those districts that have multiple buildings. The statute required a school point of contact, so I interpreted that to mean an individual building. They weren't very specific, but if you have a district that has 24 schools, you can't have one person in the central office as the school point of contact. So that, but paragraph 2 might be unnecessary if you only have a one building district. And then next one, paragraph C, is the annual staff training, which is required with the statute. Again, that was the April 2021 deadline for having everybody already trained for 2 hours, and then that's an ongoing cycle. And then the last paragraph in there is the dissemination provision, which again was required in the statute. So that's the structure of the policy. The overriding goal with this policy was really to, give some substance and framework for how a district approaches creating a coordinated plan for the multiple items that are identified in RSA 193J. So there, did I answer the question?
That was excellent.
Yeah.
What a comprehensive walkthrough. That was great.
Okay.
Thank you. Are there any considerations that school administrators should make when they are consulting with their school boards, or vice versa, school boards should be aware of in terms of the conversations that they're having around the statute with school leaders?
Sure. When we end up with these statutes that say the local school board shall adopt a policy, and right now there are over 75 statutes or regulations which say the local school board shall adopt a policy that something. And oftentimes when you get those, the local school board shall do this, the person who's communicating that to the school board is in fact the superintendent, and buried within the superintendent's duties and Department of Education regulations are basically keeping school boards advised of their legal responsibilities. They're not attorneys, but they're the ones who would bring this to school board's attention. Hey guys, we need to have this policy. that also is something that we do. So we publish the policy updates. We also publish a legislative summary that identifies not only not only those places where there's a statute that says you shall have a policy that says, but also those statutes that say you school board or you district shall do these things. So anyway, back to the real question, which was consideration. So the administration quite frequently is the one that's coming to the board. Not always the case. School boards are the governing body. They sometimes come up with their own ideas, or they get the information from us and they're really spearheading it. At least as a policy consideration, I don't see any problems with this policy, being addressed by a school board. What an administration might want to be careful of is, number one, making sure that they've done what they can to identify at least the base resources that are going to be involved in the minimal requirements of this policy. I mean, the policy, we try to stay to the minimum and then leave it to boards to expand as they see fit and as their communities are able to support. So you might have administration identifying additional components that could be included not only in the plan but in the policy. But then the other piece that is maybe interesting or maybe more sensitive in this subject matter than other places, when the policy says the superintendent go make a plan. Sometimes we'll have policies that say we shall have a committee that does these things. So the committee is informing the board, not informing the superintendent, but informing the board. And the board has created the committee. That is a public body under New Hampshire's right to know law, and it's subject to open meetings. It's subject to posting its minutes. By open meetings, meaning anybody speaking at the meeting, unless there's a non-public exception that all of that meeting has to be out in the public. And the subject matter of this policy and of this statute, it's of a kind that you might not get the most complete information if what you're really relying on are difficult and personal stories and private stories. And yes, maybe those are things that could be done in a non-public session, but committees are generally not instructed well enough with respect to the right to know law to be able to, when can we be in non-public, when can we not be in non-public. And I think in trying to develop the plan here, there probably are going to be some very difficult conversations, or maybe there should be some difficult conversations if really what you're trying to come up with is a plan to address some very, very problematic situations. So, I think in trying to decide how to approach creating your plan, I think a lot of this a lot of the base information, how to create the structure, exists not just in this policy, but in all those samples that you talk about. And I think maybe in the certainly in the first iterations of the plan, that it really should be done at a not at the 40,000 foot view of a school board, but really down at a lower level within the building, talking to the people within the building, and really identifying, people who might have information that might not want to work with a school board.
Great. Yeah, that's terrific advice and some things to keep in mind, and certainly given the sensitivity of this topic, and really within the realm of our work, we fully support and want to encourage districts to, get some family voice to the table, get some youth voice to the table, include school board members in these conversations as you're building that plan, make sure that all stakeholders are engaged and involved. So it's something that really can serve the needs of everybody in the community. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay.
That was wonderful.
Is there anything else you'd like to add, Will? Is there anything we've forgotten before we conclude our session?
No, I think I covered it all in my one answer.
Perfect. You really did. It's great.
Okay, good.
So I would just want to conclude, by thanking you, Will, for joining us today. You should feel free, viewers out there, to check out the New Hampshire School Boards Association website if you want to contact Will or any of his colleagues. Or you can contact us and we can connect you as well with our professional organization partners. And I would also encourage you to actually take a look at the technical advisory and the attached model suicide prevention policy that you can find on our website, nhstudentwellness.org. Thanks very much.
Thank you.